It's 6 o'clock tonight in Granada, in not quite so sunny Spain, but it is getting on a bit. It's 5 o'clock in London, it's midday in New York, midnight in Hong Kong, 3 a.m. in Sydney, 9 a.m. in San Francisco, and 9:30 at night in Mumbai. Greetings, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on in the world you are today. My name is Patrick L. Young, the IPO-VID Livestream, Series 26, Episode 6, for the math mavens in there who can do to the power of 6. That is episode 156. A very interesting Ferrari it was too. Episode 156 starts here, and let's drop by Kazakhstan. The Moscow Exchange is divesting its stake in the Kazakhstan Stock Exchange, according to the National Bank chairman. While KZ has benefited from the relationship with MOEX, the tricky part is the political situation beyond the markets. Thus, there will be a modicum of relief at this news from KZ, tinged with regret at the loss of working relationships with the many good folks within MOEX itself. One exchange down this year, sad to see, always the close of a parishioner. The Abu Dhabi Carbon Exchange is going to be closed down. Air Carbon CEO William Paxos was a terrific guest on IPO-VID 50, Air Carbon's net zero mission. However, amidst a race of new VCMs out there, Air Carbon is closing its Abu Dhabi exchange, remaining open in Singapore after a year. Congratulations to the 2025 Nobel laureates Darren Acemoglu, Simon Johnson, and James Robinson for showing us that economic growth is good for all and capitalism, even empires, can do a good job. Congratulations all round to them. As the Nobel Prize Committee noted, the laureates have shown that one explanation for differences in countries' prosperity is the societal institutions that were introduced during colonization. In essence, if the rule of law was sound property protection, decent democracy, and a state exists to try to serve the people and not suppress them, then your economy is likely to grow faster than the folks who don't. Speaking of people trying to grow the economy faster than those who don't in emerging markets and elsewhere, thanks very much to the AFM for a great tech day in Amsterdam, where Exchange Invest was a proud sponsor. On screen at the moment, our data panel was absolutely marvellous. Yours truly was chairing that session. Thanks to Professor Albert Menkveld, Mark Shadle, the CEO of Data BP, Paul Humphrey, the CEO of BML Technology, celebrating his $21 million investment recently, and Louis Jan Bontuis, the VP for Engineering at Housing Anywhere. And of course, you will have noticed that the first three of those gentlemen were all previous guests on our show, and the fourth, Louis Jan, has just agreed to sign up. One thing that panel was absolutely missing, ladies and gentlemen, and I must apologize for once, is unlike my podium at the New York Stock Exchange this year, where we had a rigorous management of diversity and indeed had a majority of women, that was all rather pale, male and stale. Let's see if we can find a few female data mavens for the next data panel I get to chair wherever it is in the world. And that brings us very neatly to our guest today, ladies and gentlemen, Paulina Bren. The topic is her latest book, She Wolves, The Untold History of Women on Wall Street. Paulina Bren is a writer and award-winning historian who teaches at Vassar College on the Pittsburgh Endowment Chair in the Humanities. Her previous book was the best-selling The Barbizon, The Hotel That Set Women Free, and was a New York Times editor's choice. We're delighted to welcome her here today to discuss her new book, She Wolves, The Untold History of Women on Wall Street. It's been called Enthralling by Publishers Weekly and is already the next big idea club must-read. Much more excitingly, it's going to be coming hopefully to a big screen near you in the near future, at least something like HBO and Netflix, depending on where you watch your movies, because She Wolves is in development with Mark Gordon Pictures. Paulina, welcome to IPO-VID. Where in the world are you today?
Thank you so much, Patrick. I am in the Bronx. That's where I am.
Fabulous altogether. And so remind us, for those of us whose geography is not terribly good, whereabouts actually is Vassar College where you're teaching?
So Vassar College is in what's called mid-Hudson Valley. Don't call it upstate. It's mid-Hudson Valley, so on the Hudson River, and it's about an hour and a half north of New York City.
Right. That's very useful. Thank you very much. Because
But I'm
I was
not
one of
there
those.
today.
You're not there today, clearly. No, if you're in the
It's
Bronx,
October break.
the Bronx would have had to have undergone quite an expansion to manage to
Yes.
make it there. Yes, I had a great moment the other day. Actually, we went to the Amsterdam flower market, which is the biggest flower market in the world. It's quite incredible. It's also the most beautiful, fragrant market I've ever been to, and it occupies an area of just under 2 square kilometers.
Oh my.
It was bigger than the Principality of Monaco, but the Principality of Monaco have been on a bit of a reclamation grab for the last 50 years. So they got an extra 600 square meters in to be just larger. So that there you go. Anyway, use this information. So tell us a bit about yourself, Paulina, because you have a lovely English accent, but I think you've got a very, very interesting pedigree and origin. Where were you born?
Oh, you want my origin story? Yes, I was actually born in Czechoslovakia when it was still Czechoslovakia, not the Czech Republic. And I grew up in the UK, in Watford, which was very much a working class town at the time, outside of London. But I've been in the US for ages. I went to Wesleyan University for my BA, then University of Washington, Seattle for my MA, and I have my PhD in history from New York University. And my first sort of specialty as a historian was actually post-war Europe, and especially communism in the Eastern Bloc. And so my first academic book was the story of everyday life behind the Iron Curtain in the 70s and 80s. And then I followed that up with a collected volume of essays. And when I'd done that, I sort of realized after a while that I'd sort of done what I wanted to academically. Nobody had written about the 70s and 80s before. And then I decided to do what in academia is called the famous crossover, which is kind of difficult, but it's been a joyride for me, where basically you start writing nonfiction that is readable, that people actually want to, it's a page turner that people want to read. And it's been great fun. And my focus has been on telling sort of collective stories of women in New York, but as a way of saying a much larger story about American history.
And what an interesting history it is. And actually, let's just go back to your previous book, because I think in some ways that helped you get the inspiration for your current book. So tell us a little bit about the Barbizon, because it is an amazing story altogether. And we'll get to the wolf story in a moment.
Yeah, happily. So the Barbizon Hotel was a famous women's only residential hotel in New York, and it was built in the late 1920s. And it was built for a very sort of posh young lady who wanted to come to New York and become an artiste. And a year after it opened its doors, Wall Street crashed. And so the sort of imagined clientele, to some extent, continued to go to the Barbizon, but now a wide array of sort of young women from all over America would come there. And it was sort of, if you were coming unaccompanied to New York, or if you were coming to New York to follow your ambitions and you didn't know anybody, you wanted to be in a space like the Barbizon Hotel. It was, it gave you, it was a calling card, but it also, it made you respectable, right? If you're in New York, unattended, unchaperoned, then if you're staying there. So it was a sanctuary and a safe place. And it was also a massive sort of launching pad for women coming to New York. And there were famous ones like Sylvia Plath, Grace Kelly, Joan Didion. They all lived there. There were names and names, but there were also a lot of really interesting, ordinary women. But it really tells a story from the late 1920s. Now it's a luxury condo, of course, through that period. So it tells the story of 20th century New York and the women who came to New York. But it really, in many ways, the focus is on the 50s and like what was an ambitious woman supposed to do in the 1950s when you were told you were supposed to sort of have a house and a white picket fence and 3.8 children, right? And so it tells that story. And when I was writing the Barbizon, I sort of realized there's something very odd, because in sort of the early 70s, as New York starts to become grimy and sort of urine scented, you could say. You would think that women coming to New York would flock to the Barbizon, but in fact, occupancy rates were falling, they were plummeting. And so I thought, there's a different kind of woman now who's going to embody New York and what New York means for America. And I kind of followed her, figuratively, but in one case and one character in my book, literally out of the door of the Barbizon and to Wall Street.
What? How fascinating. How really, really fascinating. And also you got another Monaco reference in there inadvertently. We didn't plan that, ladies and gentlemen, by passing on Grace Kelly during the course of the 1950s. But it's actually, it is a very, very interesting thing, because what I do find amusing is still to this day, there is this plethora of clubs which exist in the center of New York, including a lot that are remarkably, let's face it, sexist. I mean, it's not just that they're exclusively male. I mean, they are downright sexist. I can remember that one chief, actually was an exchange story, one chairman of one major London exchange being asked by the CEO of another London exchange, where should I stay when I'm in New York? And he said, oh, dear boy, stay at the XYZ Club. So he promptly checked into the XYZ Club, and the XYZ Club were fascinated by this thing that this guy had brought with him, which wore a skirt and had two legs and looked vaguely human, but was clearly not male, and was promptly informed that there was no way she could go to the bar, and she probably could have breakfast in bed if she was really lucky. And he promptly moved out. I mean, quite sensibly. He said, I'm not putting up with that. It's absolutely ridiculous. And the other chairman had never noticed, because he'd never been anywhere with a wife. So it hadn't occurred to him to even think about it. And it's interesting that they managed to survive, and they've survived to this day, admittedly fewer
there
number.
are two things. First of all, those stories of no ladies allowed and women having to climb through windows and back doors, women working on Wall Street. So many stories there, but there are actually two things here. So it's the residential hotels, and then it's the clubs. They're two separate things. So the residential hotels, it was fascinating because in the 1920s, especially women got the vote and they were coming to New York and they wanted to do something other than just, be homemakers. All these women's hotels went up. And also, I mean, they'd also been, and they were following the pattern of sort of these bachelor men residential hotels. And it was, I won't bore anybody with it now, but it was a whole bunch of reasons why this was happening. And it was a very easy, and there were different levels. You get the posh ones, you could get sort of, the YMCA was the lower ones, right? But it was a whole way of living in the early 1900s, 1920s. And then really it was the devastation of the market that really just, most of, especially the women's hotels, they fell apart. The private clubs did not fall apart because not everybody lost their money during the crash. And they continued, and they definitely play a story in She-Wolves, certainly.
So that it is very interesting, and that's why I think it's fascinating. And also, there's a very interesting underlying pinning thing, because of course we're finance nerds around here, so therefore this is such a fascinating meeting of minds. Yes, exactly. Well, you're a literary nerd. I mean, that's lovely, but it's so good to have you on the show, because there's such an interesting thing also that you mentioned that, in the 20s there was suddenly this explosion, and I think that's one of the things that defines for us the USA and New York, was that somebody somewhere thought, if I knock that up and I just focus on the demographic of women, then I'm going to get business, and this is going to work as a hotel. And whether they were male or female, the entrepreneur rapidly filled the gap. And it all does look very much like Tintin and the Land of Black Gold. It was
all the hoteliers who had already built the men-only residential hotels. And when the women suddenly had the vote and they started to sort of maneuver through their lives very differently, they were like, oh, we know how to do this, and we're going to build them for women. It's fascinating. And again, it's just like Wall Street. Nobody actually wrote a history of these hotels.
No, I think it's fascinating. Yeah.
It's amazing. Yeah.
I'm looking forward. I'm gonna go and pick a copy up actually and find that with great interest to read that, because it's really, really interesting. So the narrative, as you say, I mean, it's almost as if you're going from one movie to the next. One person leaves by the door and heads toward Wall Street. So this got you interested. You're coming to Wall Street as a complete outsider.
Yes.
Much like the woman in the 1950s that you talk about in your book.
Very much so. They didn't know where they were. Absolutely. And honestly, I mean, it was a big learning curve for me. So that was fun and also not fun. But I think nobody's written this book, and there are a lot of memoirs, some of them really good, from both men and women. on their experience on Wall Street, right? But it's particular time, particular place, particular person. And I'm really interested in telling like a sweep of a story where people can see themselves, even if they're not characters. And that's always my sort of, am I getting that response? That was the case with Barbizon, that's the case with She-Wolves. Am I telling a story that people can find themselves in? And it seems to be the case. And so I really wanted to write this that hadn't been written. And the more I started to do the research, and I discovered that these women, even the really well-known, really successful women on Wall Street, other than Mickey Siebert, who I'm sure we'll talk about, they barely have a footprint. Like if you Google them and so forth, I was really, really shocked by that. And so all the more I felt sort of the impetus of, I really want to write this American story. It's an American piece of history that needs to be out there. And that impetus to have it out there felt all the more important and timely, precisely because I was shocked. I'm used to there being a lack of sources when writing about women for various reasons. People don't feel women important. That was a problem with the Barbizon, young women, frivolous in New York. When sort of that isn't this feeling that we need to keep these documents that tell these stories. So that's always a hurdle, and I'm used to that. But the fact that these women who, in most cases, are still alive, and there's so little on them, that added a certain motivation.
But that's a really interesting motivation. And tell me then, did you manage to go and actually meet many of these women who were still alive?
I had to because,
Right.
I'm a historian, so I would prefer to dwell in the archives. But when you're writing about the women who came to Wall Street from the 1960s, and with a little flashback to the 1950s, I should say 1950s through 9/11, that's 50 years I'm writing about, there really aren't any archives. So I ended up having to very much rely on interviews with women. Fortunately, a few of them in my book, they'd done extensive oral histories for the New York Historical Society about 10, 12 years ago. And also there's a database of history makers, of particularly of Black men and women who have made an impact. And so I was able to also use that oral history database archive. But other than that, I had to use the interviews, and I had to use a lot of contemporary press, which I love using. I used in my academic books because I was also writing about the 70s and 80s and everyday life behind the Iron Curtain. And I did it with the Barbizon. It's so interesting. And some of you might have had this experience, if by any chance, because now we can stream anything. If you're rewatching a show maybe that you saw, I don't know, in the 90s or early 2000s, it's really striking because what one can say, what one says, how the world looks, how people speak, it's all there, and it feels suddenly shockingly different, right, from just 20 years ago. And so you can get the same from the contemporary press at the time. How were they talking about this? What stories were they telling about these women? So sort of those oral histories and the contemporary press was sort of the backbone of the story.
And that's really, really intriguing because, as you say, also, well, it has to also be said, I mean, the contemporary history of stock exchanges and exchanges is usually pretty lousy because it tells you what happened to the things. It doesn't tell you what happened to the people. And that's also one of the big difficulties. So it's not just sexist, but it is. But it happens to be.
It's not just sexist. No, I think it's really about the fact that the sort of the world, if we can say, is quite divided. I'm one of those people, highly educated, and somebody would talk about Wall Street, and I go, I have no idea. And so many people have said this to me, that actually reading She-Wolves was also like a really pleasant sort of learning experience of learning about Wall Street and finance. So, and then there's people who are on Wall Street and who are in finance who don't know the history, but they know the terms, they might know the economic history, right? And so what has been written, the memoirs tend to also kind of be directed at the people who have had the same experience, right? And you're right, there are a lot of books on sort of the economic history of the stock exchanges, of Wall Street, of investing, and so forth, but they don't speak to readers like me and like most readers, right? So I was really trying to make this world accessible in a way that I had to make it accessible for myself. And so that was a big challenge. And in some ways, that was kind of the most exciting thing to me, to be able to bring that world to people who don't know anything, or to bring it to a generation of men and women working on Wall Street now who have no idea about the past.
And I think that's great. And I really commend you, because actually one of the things that's part of always our mission and my firm belief, I mean, as a dyed-in-the-wool financial nerd, is we're an appalling profession, because actually when you go and interact with every other profession pretty much on earth, they all go, oh, it's simple. When you sit on a doctor's bed, for whatever, you're having, like I had my wisdom teeth taken out years ago, this doctor comes in with a very nice method, and just sits down and goes, now, Freddie here is going to knock you out and you're going to go to sleep pleasantly. And then I'm going to just, lean your head back and just do a little bit of twisting and you'll be a bit sore in the morning. I mean, he didn't bother to say he'd probably have an elbow on my neck and whatever. It didn't need to go to, but the point is he explained everything as if it was a doddle and it was all going to be fine and this is what's going to happen. Whereas the world of finance is appalling, because the world of finance opens up to you and goes, Paulina, that's fantastic. So what do you do? Oh, that's very interesting. That's great. Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, now, let me explain to you about finance, but it's complicated. And no other profession in the world do they refuse to break it down.
I'm so glad you're pointing this out, because I can really talk about this from that outsider perspective. And honestly, my methodology in talking to many, many women, not all of them became characters in my book. So I talked to a lot more than the characters that I have there. But literally, I realized within a month, I had to start off by saying, whenever there was something that I didn't understand, which was at the beginning, like every other sentence, I would say, okay, explain it to me as if you're talking to a 5-year-old. So, and it sounds ridiculous, but it was the only way to do it. And it's a skill. And when I was talking about sort of that I've done the academic crossover where I'm now, a writer who writes popular nonfiction, part of that crossover is learning or knowing how to speak to others. Like I don't read boring history books. I'm not interested in them. That's not what I want to write. And that's not what I want others to read. And so part of it is learning how to tell a story that might, somebody might go, well, that's boring. It's history. I never liked history, but make it really exciting to read and a page turner. And finance does have the same problem, I think, where, we get PhDs, but you will work in this for a long time. It's in many ways the equivalent, right? You're amassing knowledge. And the inability to explain it to others, I think, is a problem in some ways, which it was very interesting to me. And it did help to say, because it was interesting to see how when I said to the women, talk to me as if I'm a 5-year-old, they really had to think about, like, how do I explain my life? How do I explain this happened, right?
Absolutely. And it's vitally important at all points in time in finance. If you can't invent your own buzzword and acronym and therefore have one of those sort of like BS bingo cards that you can fill in the first 5 minutes, it's just not happening, which is totally alienating from what goes on. And actually, I must say, on a separate note, I mean, full marks to Professor Albert Menkfeld. He was a previous guest on this show talking about something fabulously nerdy, but he broke it down. But like last week, he was on a data panel and we took all of this incredibly complex financial math, and he said, look, let me explain it like this. And there is a man who can, in one sense, lives a life that's only in Greek letters, and in another can manage to break it down for normal people. It is so rare. It is so rare and it's so beautiful. So back to your wonderful tale of narratives, ladies and gentlemen. We're talking about She-Wolves, The Untold History of Women on Wall Street. It is your must read. If you don't have a copy already in your Christmas stocking or your Christmas list, definitely get it. I got to say, I love the cover as well. I think that beautiful lipstick kiss on that.
The picture doesn't do it justice.
No, the picture's not doing it justice.
Stands out more, and the kiss is sort of shiny and embossed. Yeah, it's very cool.
It's really cool. It's a fabulous color altogether. So talk to me a little bit about it. I mean, where should we start? I mean, obviously, I think everybody starts at Muriel Siebert, because even the New York Stock Exchange's own endless amounts of histories can't help but avoid Muriel Siebert because she really is an incredible
Because they
trailblazer.
shouldn't avoid her, right?
No, absolutely. I mean,
In fact,
they cannot afford
she
to.
should have even more of a spotlight, in my opinion. And one of the great things is that this book just came out a month ago, I think, to the day. And whenever I have a book that comes out, readers write to me, and I've definitely been getting, oh, I knew Muriel. She was amazing. She was such a storyteller. She was so kind and generous with people. She didn't take any BS, those sorts of things. So that's been great. So Muriel Siebert, for those of you who don't know, she was called Mickey Siebert. She took a path that was, to begin with, very similar to the early women on Wall Street. She did in the 1950s. Women were especially doing the 60s and 70s, which was and then her path sort of diverged a bit. But she arrived in New York in 1954 in a beat-up Studebaker with $500 in her pocket. She dropped out of college. Her father died of cancer, and she wanted out of Cincinnati. And so she arrived there and she applied. She didn't know where else. But the summer before, she'd been on a tourist bus in New York, and they'd gone to the New York Stock Exchange. And so she thought, oh, Wall Street. So she applied for a job. She admitted she was a college dropout. She didn't get the job. She learned, I have quite a number of women who did this. They learned, oh, wait, I have to actually kind of fudge the truth to get a job. So she did, and she got a job at a brokerage house as sort of the teletypist person in a research department, where she was running the questions from the teletype machine to the research analysts. And she did what these early women did, looked and listened. And she realized that, the numbers were a science, as she said, but also it was an art form. And when she looked at a page with numbers, it lit up like a Broadway marquee, she said. In other words, she had a knack for it. And there came a point in those days when the research analysts, if they were doing a really good job, one of the perks was they could now toss off some of what they didn't want onto the underlings who were training. And that included Mickey. And this brilliant train specialist who taught her a lot, he didn't think the airline industry was going to be much. So he gave that to her. And another very common story that happened to a lot of women, they got what was considered the scraps, but turned out to sort of be the cutting edge new industry. So she became an aviation expert, a research analyst, and she went from one small brokerage house to another, always got a pay raise, or a promotion or promotion. But young men would come in with no experience and they'd out-salary her, and she had enough. She also couldn't go to the major firms because they were literally not hiring women outside of the secretarial pool the way women were getting a foothold, because in those days, there were hundreds and hundreds of small partner-owned brokerage firms. So her friend, Gerald Sy, who was very famous gunslinger, as they called them in the 60s, finance guy, he said, well, you're not going to get anywhere at this rate. Why don't you just buy a seat on the New York Stock Exchange? She was like, what? No women are allowed. He's like, I think maybe look at the Constitution. So she did, which was written in 1792. And they hadn't envisioned women on the floor. So there was nothing against women being on the floor. And so that started her journey, which I won't get into. It was very hard. And she was getting a seat, which was like $445,000 at the time. It was $4 million, around $4 million today. And she finally got her seat. And she was the first woman, January 1st, 1968. But she knew she could not actually trade on that seat. Right. Because she would get so many enemies. So she basically created her own firm and used that seat.
Yes. But it is quite interesting. And as you say, how you have to use an air of cunning to manage to get round the system. So if it doesn't expressly forbid you, because fortunately, as you say, in 1792, when they're all sitting underneath that buttonwood tree, nobody actually thought about the ludicrous notion that women would ever want to come and trade. I mean, how ridiculous. Yes. Yeah. And secondly, the other thing you hit on, which is great, is that actually, I got the finance business all wrong. That's why probably I'm presenting this podcast all these years later. But what I got wrong was I really thought that when you talked about gunslingers, and that's a great thing from the 60s that we talk about, and lots of people are convinced from the outside that sort of finance people on Wall Street are these incredible titans who know everything. They're sort of somewhere between James Bond, but without the stunts. But they're always seen in a tuxedo, and they understand implicitly 150,000 things about history, the arts, and goodness knows whatever. And they really are genuinely kind of Renaissance men. Whereas you get into finance and you suddenly realize that everybody occupies the most unbelievably tiny tranche of existence. And for Muriel Siebert, actually sitting at the teletype machine was fantastic, because she was sitting at the hub. It's like she was sitting at the hub of the internet. She knew what was going on better than 99% of the firm. If you had the brain, you could do it.
And that's the thing. All the women who were coming in, they were secretaries, receptionists, teletype, data entry clerks. And so they were really, and when I say, they sat and listened and watched, they really did. And in many cases, they also had really lazy bosses,
right,
who would send them to meetings instead of themselves. And so they learned that way too. And speaking of sort of the specialized nature of finance jobs, I think it was, honestly, back in the 60s and 70s, I think it was less of that. I think, especially because there were so many small firms, you did have to have an overview in the way that you don't today. The interesting thing to me too was, so one of the women, Doreen, who worked on the American Stock Exchange and the New York Stock Exchange, she was one of the first people I interviewed, and she said at that time that she arrived on American Stock Exchange on May Day, 1975. And
wow. So just point that out. So just in case anybody doesn't follow that, May Day 1975 is the day when the New York Stock Exchange effectively got rid of fixed commissions, because it's difficult to believe that the US fixed commissions. This also leads us back into my pointer that, the greatest president from the history of the financial market standpoint was Richard Milhous Nixon, whose reputation is somehow troubled by some of the things he did in his macro environment. But actually for markets, he was very good, because he took the dollar off the gold standard and therefore basically created derivatives. And he took us out of commission, which was actually something that the New York Stock Exchange had been wanting to do for 5-6 years before.
They'd been dragging their feet. They just realized they had to do it. There was no choice, because of all the other, more regional exchanges that, were more flexible, right? So they had to do it. But she arrived that very day on the American Stock Exchange, and her stepfather, who'd gotten her the job, she was a classic, had to drop out of college because her stepfather's firm went under, because during the whole paper crisis, somebody was just stashing stocks and they were not actually processing them. Again, so many fascinating stories. So there she was, also having to drop out of college, and she arrives on May Day, which basically means that, you need to hustle from that point on, right? And she's a great hustler, so it was perfect for her, it turned out. But anyway, she told me that at some point she went for a meeting to the Financial Women's Association, which was an association created in the early 1950s by the very first women on Wall Street who were outside of the secretarial pool. And they basically, as one of them said, we created it because we had nobody to have lunch with. And then it grew. So she went to one of these meetings and she said that was it. Like, I think she even left midway. And she said these were not her women. They were not her Wall Street women. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, well, it's a question of brains and brawn. And I was like, what? And I then came to understand exactly what she meant. And women on the stock exchanges, they had to have brains too. But it was a very different kind of personality. So that was really fascinating to sort of get to know, like, these people on the stock exchange versus the people in investment and brokerage. And it was great. And I have to say, like, there was something feisty about those exchange women. And one of my favorite is Louise Jones, who was found abandoned in a phone booth on the Upper West Side as a newborn. Grew up in the projects in Staten Island. At 17, she was in a work-study program at a Staten Island high school, and she got a job as a teletypist on the New York Stock Exchange. And she said she walked onto that floor. And remember, that floor was not like today. Today, I went to the floor and I was like, it's like a sleepy Monday afternoon at a mall. This was the New York Stock Exchange, where it was loud and crazy and thousands of people. And she got onto that as a 17-year-old. She just stood there and she said, for the first time in her life, she felt like she could breathe. And then she looked around and she's like, and she said to herself, I'm going to make so much, I can't say the word, I don't think, money. And she did. And she did. But, you know, there's something about those women on the stock exchanges, which, and ironically, they were some of the toughest places to start. The first woman who went on the New York Stock Exchange, it was in 1976. So, you know, Muriel Siebert gets her seat in 1968. First woman to actually trade on the floor is 1976. Alice Jocko. She had to be persuaded because she knew it would be bad. She had no idea. I mean, it was horrific, the experiences. She had to have a police escort for a while.
Well, we're going to get back to that in just a minute. I'm going to give you a little break for a second, Paulina, so you can have a glass of water and something to fortify you for the next 20 minutes of the show, because it's such a gripping discussion. We're here talking about She Wolves, the Untold History of Women on Wall Street, ladies and gentlemen, with Paulina Bren. It's a fascinating discussion altogether. But, you know, out there, in the big wide world, a lot of people have been talking, is China facing a crisis? So let's drop by one of our short videos, because China's stock market's down 40%, the economy's slowing, but there's 200 million people invested, a lot at stake, and twice as many people in the stock market as there are actually in the Chinese Communist Party. Let's have a short video. Meanwhile, in big world, is there a China crisis? Well, certainly the Chinese Politburo is rather vexed, ladies and gentlemen. What they're looking at is a stock market that was down 40% since the all-time highs 3 years ago, and a sluggish economy. That said, sluggish economy in Chinese terms isn't necessarily what it means in the US or Europe, but we'll get back to that in a moment. When you're looking at these things, though, it's important to bear in mind one big statistic overlying the whole Chinese economy. There may be 100 million faithful members of the Chinese Communist Party, but ultimately there are no fewer than 200 million people, twice as many adults, are invested in the stock market. For more in Big World, like or follow. And that, I suppose, brings us, ladies and gentlemen, to a fabulous book on the long term. As you know, we have a book of the week. Our current book of the week is Common Stocks and Uncommon Profits by Philip A. Fisher. Well, who sums it up better than Warren Buffett? I sought out Phil Fisher after reading his Common Stock, Uncommon Profits and other writings. A thorough understanding of the business obtained by using Phil's techniques enables one to make intelligent investment commitments. Our next book of the week, of course, will be featured on Saturday in the EI Weekend Edition. That's a more macro read about the world in general, which is absolutely free via exchangeinvest.com. However, if you're enjoying this and you're interested in the world of bourses, or indeed if you're working in the world of bourses, you can't afford to be without the exchange of information. Exchange Invest, that's published Monday through Friday. Join us by subscribing at exchangeinvest.com. We're offering a free 7-day trial as things stand. Now, back to Paulina Bren. We left it on a very, well, a cliffhanger of sexism, because we had these ladies who were just going onto the floor, 1976. We're speeding through the story. You mentioned the fact that Louise, the very first person to trade on the floor, needed a police escort.
Alice Jocko,
yes, Alice. Sorry, I'm so sorry. Alice Jocko, of course. I cannot imagine just how difficult that must have been at that point in time. Probably you can't either, even though you've heard the stories. How did things progress? I'm sure there was an incredible amount of sexism from start to finish.
Well, I want to address the last thing you said, when you said, you probably can't imagine. So what was interesting about writing this, I too thought initially, well, you know, how much will I have in common with these women? Like how will I relate to them? And as I was writing She Wolves, I was thinking, this is kind of, you know, obviously it's turbo drive because of money and testosterone, but this is sort of the story of all women who went into the workforce in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And I've discovered that in giving talks and so forth, where women have come up to me and men and have said, I wasn't in finance, but I was in this industry. I was in publishing, for example. And what you're saying, or in advertising, and what you're saying is just, it's my story as well. So I think we need to also be a little bit careful. Like, this is why I was saying this is an American story. So yes, Wall Street is very particular, but let's not be delusional about that either, right?
No, that's a very, very good point. And thank you for picking me up on it, because yes, the same things happened every day. Possibly the one and only difference with finance is that it would have been even more brazen, because you were in an environment where you could be one or two women standing quite literally in a very, very, very close atmosphere. And I mean, good grief, the futures pits and so on, and the options pits were even worse, because people stand absolutely close, shoulder to shoulder. But there could be 500 blokes and one woman. I mean.
If I can actually tag on to that. So yes, She Wolves is optioned, and they're trying to turn it into a TV series. Sort of the idea was sort of like, I think, like a Mad Men kind of version, right? As I started the research, it's a wonderful team, and they wanted me to send them information. And so I was learning as they were learning. And I think we were all shocked. And this is problematic for us setting up a TV series, is exactly what you just said. There'd be like 2 women and 500 men up until, late 70s, early 80s. So, that's that kind of like the numbers. And once you start to really think about it and write about it and imagine it as a visual form, like, how do you tell the story that 2 women and 500 men, right? But if you want to tell a story, a sort of a collective women's story in that moment. But yes, I mean, the women, you said before when I was telling one of the stories about how sort of with Muriel Siebert, she had to sort of be wily. I think that's very true. There were 2 things that women definitely had to possess. Well, 3 things: a thick skin, a certain ability to figure out the terrain and how to get around it. And they all said you had to learn to have a serious sense of humor, or at least sort of, the showmanship of humor, because you would get horrible remarks all the time. But at the same time, those 499 men who hadn't made the remark in that moment are all looking at you to see how you're going to respond.
And it's quite interesting, because if you showed a sense of humor about yourself, then actually the tables could turn. People would start to respect you. But it was incredibly difficult.
No, that didn't happen usually. They said no, they had to keep plowing forward with humor. It was constant deflection with humor. And that's the thing. And you would think, and going back to Alice Jarko, who is the first woman on the New York Stock Exchange to be trading on the floor instead of just working on the floor, she went in thinking that she thought that as she'd get more respect, the lewd comments, the things left in her booth, the things, I don't think I'm allowed to say what they were, sent down the pneumatic tubes, she thought that would actually get better, but it got worse. And she got it from different people. So as she started to make much larger trades, and she was responsible for a lot more, the specialists started to respect her. But then sort of the runners and the clerks and other traders who had not been maybe as bad before were now going after her. So, this idea that you're going to get, that's a very, no offense, Patrick, it's a very male point of view, that, that if you're funny enough, you keep going, you'll get respect. At least in this period of time, that didn't happen. It was just, you had to keep doing it as a survival tactic, and to show that it's not going to phase you. That was very important.
And you know what? I'm going to walk that back, because actually I was thinking about a specific instance of a specific person. It was actually, anyway, the point is, I think they endured 11 months of hell before there was one incident that actually turned the whole thing in their favor. So
and that did
much
happen.
much
That's
more.
fair. That's
I mean,
fair, I think. Yeah.
much more a second real moment, or episode 7 of your series out of 12 or something, rather than episode 2 or 3.
Yeah, exactly.
So no, so that is quite a fair point. And actually,
Yeah.
Anne Berg is probably going to criticize me in the morning for such a ridiculous comment in the first place. But it's great to hear from you, Anne.
Okay.
Hello.
She's calling me absolutely scintillating. So Anne, I'm on your side.
Absolutely scintillating. Strikes a chord with my Chicago experience in the 1980s. This is the woman who actually lived, well, not obviously in the hotels you're talking about. I do believe you're in Hell's Kitchen as a coffee broker in the in the late 70s, early 80s, Anne, if I remember correctly. You were living there. Anne, a previous guest on IPO-VID, very, very interesting to talk to you about commodities business the world over. And truly, I mean, in your group of ladies who were amongst a relatively few who went through the Chicago Board of Trade and became a director.
And the commodity exchanges, oh my God, I tip my hat to you, Anne. I really do. And I'm curious, like, well, she's not there now, but what I want to say, what's also interesting, so you have these women coming in the 50s, very few, but, you know, icons, or icon, Mickey Siebert. 60s, they're coming, and they're taking two routes. There's business school, and there's the sort of college dropout or trying to find a job, end up on Wall Street because the pay is a little bit better as a receptionist, and sort of ending up being a research analyst and then ending up being a portfolio manager and that kind of route. But then what happens is, up until early 1980s, Wall Street is still kind of a backwater. And then it explodes. It absolutely explodes, as we all know. In the early 80s, it's now the place to come to. New York is now not as urine-centered as it was before. It's also seeing a comeback, right? So the whole landscape changes. And now you have completely different women coming. Now, first of all, Wall Street needs bodies. They're less discerning on whose body that is. So not once you're in the workplace, but in terms of hiring. So you're seeing these hiring surges, right, for men and women. And women are coming now. They're coming from MBA programs. Like, my book starts with the first 8 women accepted to Harvard Business School in 1963, and sort of the hell they go through, right? But now it's, you know, all these women with MBAs and women who are graduating from Ivy League schools, and they go to the career office, and the career office is just kind of it becoming a pipeline onto Wall Street. So everything changes. And of course, there's like real tension from, at least from what I understand, from both sides were telling me this, real tension between these two generations of women. And that was really interesting to see. This is not a sort of, you know, some monolithic story about women coming to Wall Street. There's obviously great complexity here. And of course, we haven't even gotten into the question of race.
Well, and I think you had, but actually, the point you hit, I'm not sure that that's just a female on female thing. I think that's a male female thing as well, because actually there's two observations I make. One is the arrival of the graduate tumult, as opposed to, you know, one of your family went into stock brokerage, one went into the military, one went into whatever. And I think there's an incredible degree of tension there, because there were a huge number of people who worked for it through 30 or 40 years. And actually, when things like the money market and the commodities exchanges took off, they just couldn't find people to work there. So it allowed people to propel who would have not got jobs otherwise.
You're absolutely right. I mean, the amount of stories I heard of, literally, they would take some 22-year-old who just graduated, I don't know, from Cornell, let's say, and plop him into a chair and turn him into a trader in 2 weeks. Yes. And you're absolutely right. These are not necessarily people. Not to diss them, but no. You're right. There was so many spots suddenly to fill.
Well, we were sitting in a tapas bar in Granada last night, and actually the point was, this guy could remember everything we wanted, including our tapas to 7 decimal places. And I was saying, you know, 40 years ago, that guy would have been working on the floor of a commodity or stock exchange, because he had that ability to be a broker, maybe not a trader, but to actually stand around the pits and just process orders. And I think there was an incredible tension, therefore, with the whole graduatization. And actually, I would say something else, which is rather controversial, which is, actually, the graduate trainee business has been the worst thing in the history of financial markets for meritocracy, because the old-fashioned system had an incredible carrière vers le talent. As long as you were the best man for the job, it didn't matter if you're male, female, whatever, you got there eventually.
And this is the argument I also make, that ironically what happened is even though Alice Jocko, as I said, had the most horrendous experience on the New York Stock Exchange, I mean, she planted the flag and led the way. And what happened in the 80s, as the rest of Wall Street is closing up, and the kind of women who, able to really climb that ladder's closed to them now.
Yeah.
And instead it's just sort of these women who very highly trained and Ivy League graduates. So in fact, as a place, like a lot of the women in the 70s said to me that, and despite all the hell they might have gone through, all the lewd remarks and blah, 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 that it was really a meritocracy they were in. By the 80s, you can't say that for these types of women who are not coming from the Ivy Leagues, who are not coming from the MBA programs. But that meritocracy kind of shifts to the exchange floors and to some extent the trading floors.
Yes.
And that's also a really interesting part of the story, where sort of that dream of what Wall Street could theoretically be is carried through there, whereas it's really curtailed on sort of investment and brokerage.
Yes, and speaking as somebody who wrote a book saying that all floors will die, the thing that I find the saddest is the fact that essentially where floors have died out almost exclusively, the real tragedy is that the meritocracy has also been killed to a much greater degree because you cannot get in.
Absolutely. And that's why, like, She-Wolves would not be such a fun story if I were writing from, let's say, 1980 to today.
No.
The fact that I start in the 1950s exactly allows to tell that story that I think people aren't aware of, where despite how hard it was to climb that ladder, really unique, interesting women who never would have had those chances. I don't want to sound like this uber capitalist here, but they were really getting a chance to do something. And even though they're out-salaried by men, they were out-salarying other women, right, in other workplaces. It was such a different environment. And it's also what was fascinating to me, just how the look and feel of Wall Street, how different it was before the 80s. I mean, it really was this small community. People knew each other. When you worked on Wall Street, you worked on Wall Street and the surrounding streets. You didn't work in Midtown. And so you could really, you saw each other, you'd all go to the same restaurant. It was very different. The feel of it, the look of it, and in some cases, the opportunities of it. Yes.
Yes, I mean, it was in many ways, it had barely evolved in a certain sense, which was the village feel from where they'd been with the stockades and the original building of the South Street Seaport. And actually, the New York Stock Exchange's official list of sort of 1785 or 1795 or 1810 or 1815, which included the price of that day's furs, which I'm sure would have everybody on the streets protesting these days if the New York Stock Exchange remotely had the inclination, which it doesn't. Yes, it doesn't, to trade. So we're left with this incredible story. I've got to ask you, I mean, it's been such an interesting conversation altogether. And unfortunately, we're going to run out of time. But I mean, when you look at this and you bring the story up to 2001, does that inspire you to do something else in the world of finance? Or indeed, are you so focused on this possible TV series now? Or how
No, I'm already thinking about my next book. I don't know why I do this to myself, why I torture myself this way. But it's the same thing when I finished the Barbizon. Everybody's like, you need to write another book about a hotel. It'll be so successful. And I was like, well, I just wrote a book about a hotel. I don't want to write a book about a hotel. And of course, at the same time, I'm getting all this new information from readers. She-Wolves is happening the exact same thing. I'm getting all these great stories that I wish I could, do part 2. But I'm not going to say what I'm thinking of doing, but I think I'm starting to see the Barbizon and She-Wolves as like part of a loose trilogy. And I will do a third book, which continues to sort of tell a certain kind of story. You could say these are stories about women and ambition, right? And like, what the heck to do with it?
That's very tantalizing, it's got to be said. And now you're going to make us wait in the publishing cycle probably 2 years before we find out
In the
what it
meantime, you
is.
can all buy She-Wolves for
We
yourselves
can
and
all
everyone.
buy She-Wolves. No, definitely buying She-Wolves, I think, is the big thing to do. And I'm certain that if she hasn't already, Anne Berg's definitely out there trying to get a copy of it right now. And it's actually upcoming as one of our books of the week, probably before the end of the year, I'd imagine. So it's really, really gripping. We were waiting for it to be in stores. Of course, at this stage of the show, and you have previously signaled the fact that you're not remotely a financial nerd, but we take no prisoners on one question in this program. So we do have to ask you, Paulina, where do you think the capital market revolution goes next?
Well, I'm going to say a revolution is all about equality, right? But I would say, a common argument for like why there should be real equality in finance, and elsewhere is the whole argument of, well, women have, will bring certain talents and they can do this, they can do that. They're good at listening, they're good storytellers, they can do this. No, I think it's a very essentialist argument. And again, this impulse to like qualify why women should have an equal spot. It's very simple. We know that when there's equality and diversity, we do better. And it's quite simple. Women are 50% of the population. And structurally, Wall Street continues to be based around the ideal worker being the man, right? And my book shows that. I talk a lot about women's bathrooms, toilets. Women didn't have anywhere to go because literally these places were built for men. And so I think really it's just time to change the playbook. And it's not even that radical. 50% of the population. It's a revolution that doesn't feel revolutionary to me, I suppose.
It's a tradition of this show that we never make a comment about what the person has said before to validate it or not. But I have to say that's spot on, actually, Paulina Bren. I completely agree with you. Anne Berg, you've got a seller. Anyway, today you've got one sale. Of course I will buy, says Anne Berg. And that seems to be only fair. And indeed, look, when we look back on this incredible story, She-Wolves, The Untold History of Women on Wall Street, I would actually like to draw attention to where I was on July the 5th, which was on the podium of the incredible New York Stock Exchange. And one of the things we set out to do was to make absolutely sure that we could get a podium that actually had a majority of women, because there is nothing worse than the many, many, many podia of bell ringings at exchanges around the world, which seem to have pale male and stale audiences, majority male audiences of all manner of other races. And it always seems to me that women are an afterthought. And I think the best thing about this is all those ladies who are there, and I speak not only of president of the New York Stock Exchange. This is great. We're on a second consecutive female president, having waited, 300 years to get to the first one. Lynn Martin is there, of course, absolutely fantastic, just standing behind the copy of my book to my right, but also a great woman of achievement. There's Anne Berg in the front row. We've got Mary Ann Callahan from the DTCC. We've got leading former central banker in Haiti, who was actually on Beata's show, PhD, last week. It's a great show with some fantastic people, including Kelly Hoey et al. And that, to me, is very, very important, to bring the vibrancy of that diversity to markets. So that's really important. Let me also remind you, ladies and gentlemen, we had a fantastic show just a few weeks ago when we were inside the hallowed halls of the New York Stock Exchange. We talked to three terrific members of the NYSE management team. Megan Duggan, who unfortunately has now departed and moved on. We wish you all the best, Megan. You remain our favorite female options nerd on the planet. Jessica Froats was absolutely sensational. Cassandra Sayer, what an interesting tale of life she has to tell. Super show with just three of the many women who are working inside the exchange structure. And if I may say a little word in defense of, I think, what's been going on in the last 20 or 30 years, I actually think exchanges have done better than perhaps the overall markets in actually managing to promote women, which I think is a really, really good thing. However, this show, ladies and gentlemen, is all about She-Wolves, The Untold History of Women on Wall Street with Paulina Bren. It's been an absolutely marvelous opportunity to chat to you today. I really appreciate it, Paulina, and I'm delighted to see that you made it through the whole hour of a nerdy financial show and you weren't unnerved at all. Thank you so much for that.
It was great fun. Thank you so much.
Good. I'm delighted that you enjoyed it. And let us just therefore conclude by bringing you news of next week. We're going to be on the quoted company Companies Agenda with the head of the UK Quoted Companies Alliance, James Ashton. We will be in the same place in the Ether Sphere at the same time at 5 o'clock London time, 6 o'clock Central European time, midday New York time. That'll be IPO-VID 157. From me, Patrick Young, thank you very, very much to Anne Berg for your great contributions. Herself, a truly pioneering woman, not on Wall Street directly, but in the world of commodities and related financial products. Let me say thank you very, very much to our fantastic all-female production team today, Herminia, Janella, and Jamil. You've done a great job. My name is Patrick L. Young. If you want a marketplace built, do please give us a call. I'll see you on Exchange Invest Monday through Friday. And in the meantime, I wish you a great week in life and markets. Thank you, Paulina Bren.